30 years ago, I stood at my sister's grave, and I thought that was the last time I'd ever hear her name. But last month, just after midnight, my phone rang. And the voice on the other end said, "It's me, Anna." For a moment, I genuinely believed I was still dreaming. The house was silent, the kind of silence that only exists in the deep hours of the night. The clock in the hallway ticked loud enough to sound like a hammer in my chest. My phone screen lit up the darkness beside my bed, and there it was, an unknown number. Midnight calls are never good news at my age. At 66, you learn that no one calls just after midnight to say something pleasant. It's always bad news: hospitals, police, loss. I hesitated, staring at that glowing screen, my heartbeat pounding in my ears like a drum. I almost didn't pick up. Almost. But something deep inside me, that same instinct that used to jolt me awake when Anna was just a little girl crying in the next room, made me reach for the phone. "Hello." My voice cracked with sleep and something else I couldn't name. And then I heard it. A soft, fragile voice. Shaky. "John. Is this John?" I froze. No one had called me John with that particular tone in decades. Not since her. "Who's this?" I whispered. The line crackled faintly. Then came the words that would turn my entire world upside down. "It's me. Anna." My body went cold. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. It was impossible. Anna died in 1994. I'd watched them lower her coffin into the ground. I'd knelt on that frozen earth, clutching a handful of soil, whispering goodbye. I'd carried that moment for 3 long decades. And yet, that voice, it was hers. Older. Rougher. But unmistakable. Before I tell you what happened next, if you love powerful, true, and emotional stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Because this one changed my life. I sat there in the dark, my heart hammering, hands trembling around that little glowing phone. "Anna," I whispered, as if saying her name might make the world make sense again. But deep down, I already knew, this call would change everything. I stared at the glowing screen, the unknown number still active. My mouth had gone dry. For 30 years, I'd trained myself to live with Anna's absence. I'd learned how to breathe through silence, how to smile through birthdays she never saw, how to talk about her without shattering. But nothing prepares you for the moment the dead come calling. The clock struck 12, each chime echoing through the house like a countdown. I pressed the phone tighter to my ear, my pulse hammering against my temples. "Who is this?" I whispered again, though part of me was terrified to hear the answer. The voice trembled, like someone learning how to speak after too many years of silence. "John, it's me. Anna." Every nerve in my body jolted. I sat upright in bed, the bedsheets twisting around my legs. My heart wasn't just beating. It was crashing, the way it did the night they told me she was gone. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to hold on to reason. "This isn't funny," I said, barely able to get the words out. "Whoever you are, this is sick. My sister died 30 years ago. I buried her." "I know," she breathed. Her voice cracked on the second word. "I know how long it's been." There was breathing on the other end, shallow, uneven, almost frightened. My skin prickled. It wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it. That softness. That quiver. The way she dragged my name out the same way she used to when she was scared of thunderstorms. She whispered something else. A word I hadn't heard in 3 decades. Johnny. That was her name for me. Her only name for me. No stranger could have known it. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, feet landing on the cold floorboards. My hands trembled so badly I could barely keep the phone steady. "Where are you?" I finally managed. There was a pause, a soft rustle like wind passing through leaves. I don't know, she said. It's dark. It's a place by the coast. They call it Harbor Rest. My breath hitched. That was a small seaside town 5 hours from where I lived. I've been here a long time, she continued, her voice uncertain, like she was trying to remember who she was as she spoke. I didn't know who to call. But I saw something tonight. A name. Yours. It felt real. Anna, my throat tightened around her name. The last time I'd said it was at her grave. She hesitated. Do you remember the swing behind the house? She asked softly. How you used to push me higher and higher until I screamed at you to stop. I stopped breathing. No one knew about that swing. Not the sound of her laughter, not the smell of Mom's pie cooling on the windowsill. Only we knew. I wanted to ask her more. I wanted to demand proof. But a deeper part of me already knew. Somehow, against all logic, my sister was alive. Her breathing grew faint, as if she was struggling to stay on the line. Johnny, she whispered again. Please, find me. And then the call went dead. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loud. The kind that makes your chest tighten. The kind that tells you everything is about to change. I sat there in the dark, clutching the phone like a lifeline. Anna was gone for 30 years. And now, in a single midnight call, she'd come back, not as a memory, but as a living voice reaching through the darkness. I didn't sleep another second that night. By dawn, I knew one thing for certain, I was going to Harbor Rest. Whether this was a cruel lie or the truth I'd been waiting 3 decades to hear. I needed to find her. And this time, if anyone stood in my way, they'd regret it. The hours after that midnight call stretched like a lifetime. As I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the phone on the table, my mind wasn't in the present anymore. It was 1994 again. I could smell the wet earth from that spring night, hear the sound of sirens in the distance, and feel the cold weight of grief pressing down on my chest like a steel plate. Anna was 20 when she died, or at least, when they said she did. Back then, she was all light. My baby sister, 6 years younger than me, always barefoot, always running too fast, laughing too loud. She had that wild energy that made everything feel alive. I used to tease her about how she could never sit still, but truth was, I loved it. It reminded me there was still something good in a world that often felt cold and small. She was studying in the city then, a bright-eyed college student, stubborn and fearless. That night she was supposed to take the last bus home for the weekend. I still remember her voice over the payphone. Don't be late to pick me up, Johnny, she'd said. She always said my name like it was both a joke and a promise. I'd laughed and told her I'd be there waiting with hot chocolate. That was the last time I heard her laugh. Around 11:30 that night, the bus never arrived. At first, I thought it was just late. But then the sirens started, far down the highway. The air that night was cold, the kind of cold that bites your skin. I remember the police officer's flashlight sweeping across the wet pavement, the twisted metal, the broken glass. The bus had veered off the highway after swerving to avoid a truck. 16 people died that night. They told us Anna was one of them. They found her purse in the wreckage. Her student ID. A charred jacket that matched the one she was wearing. They said the body they'd pulled out was hers. And when they opened that black bag in the coroner's office, all I could see was a face broken by fire and glass. It didn't look like her anymore, but I'd told myself it was. I'd signed the paper. I'd said the words, yes, that's my sister. I lived with that decision for 30 years. Our mother collapsed at the funeral. She died 5 years later, and I swear she never really came back from that day. Father was already gone by then, so it was just me standing there, lowering my little sister into the ground, promising myself I'd never let anyone hurt our family again. But there was no one to fight. Just fate. I remember how still the cemetery was. There were no birds. Just wind threading through the trees. The headstone was simple, she'd always hated fuss. Anna Marie. 1974 to 1994. Always our light. I'd carved those words myself. They burned in me like a wound that never closed. After the funeral, everything changed. I stopped laughing. I stopped going to church. I worked, I aged, but a part of me stayed stuck on that highway, staring at a twisted bus and wondering if I could have saved her somehow. I buried her, but the guilt buried me too. And now, after all those years of silence, that same voice I'd thought was gone forever had found its way back to me through a midnight call. My hands gripped the edge of the kitchen table as the memories swarmed like a storm. Her face when she was 16, her freckles, the way she used to braid her hair, the way she'd hug me too tightly when she was scared. I'd spent decades convincing myself those things were gone forever. But if that really was Anna on the phone, then everything I thought I knew about that night, the wreck, the funeral, the grave, was a lie. A cold thought slid through me like a blade. Someone made me believe she was dead. Someone made sure she vanished. And if Anna had lived through that crash, then someone out there had stolen 30 years of her life. I pushed back from the table, the chair scraping against the tiles. There was no more room for grief. The grief I'd lived with was being replaced by something else now, something sharp, dangerous, alive. Rage. I whispered her name again, not like a brother mourning a sister, but like a man making a promise. Anna. I'm coming for you. And whoever did this to you, they'll pay. The clock struck 3 a.m. outside, the night was still. But inside me, something that had been dead for a long time was awake again. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the living room, fully awake, staring at the dim glow of the phone screen as if it held the answers. I replayed that voice in my head over and over. Every syllable. Every breath. It wasn't just familiar, it was her. I'd know Anna's voice anywhere, even 30 years later. But the rational part of me screamed that it couldn't be real. Anna was gone. I'd seen her coffin lowered. I'd signed the documents. I'd carried her death like a scar on my chest. And yet, the way she said, "Johnny," the tremor in her voice, the memories she shared about the swing behind the house, no stranger could have known that. I picked up the phone and scrolled through the call log again. Unknown number. No name. But the area code matched Harbor Rest, the small coastal town she'd mentioned. I'd never been there in my life. Why would someone from there call me in the middle of the night? I poured myself a cup of black coffee just to keep my hands from shaking. Steam curled into the air. My reflection in the kitchen window looked older, harder. There was something in my eyes I hadn't seen in years, not hope, but something close. I sat at the table, whispering into the silence. Anna, what happened to you? The phone buzzed again around 2:45 a.m., a text message this time. No name. Just an address. Harbor Rest Community Home. Room 12. Come. That was it. No explanation. No plea. Just those 3 words. I stared at the message for a long time. If this was real, if Anna was truly alive, then this was the closest I'd been to her in 3 decades. But if it was a trap? If someone was using her name? If this was some twisted way to get to me? Then walking into it blind would be stupid. And yet, I knew I'd go. You don't ignore your sister's voice after 30 years of silence. I walked down the hallway to the small room I keep locked, Anna's old room. I hadn't touched it in decades. The door creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was heavy with old memories. The posters still on the wall, the books she loved stacked on a shelf, the faded photograph of the 2 of us smiling at the fair. I sat on the edge of her bed and let my hands rest on the quilt she'd sewn with Mom the year before she died. The last night she slept in this room, she'd hugged me and said, "Don't ever stop looking out for me, Johnny." I'd failed her. But now, maybe, I had a second chance. I stood up, pulled on my jacket, and grabbed the keys from the counter. There wasn't a single doubt left in me. I was going to harbor rest, and I wasn't coming back without answers. As I turned off the lights, I felt a slow burn in my chest, anger and resolve twisting together like barbed wire. Whoever had taken her, hidden her, or buried the truth, they'd made a mistake. A big one. I whispered into the darkness, "Hold on, Anna. I'm coming." And with that, I walked out into the cold night, not as the broken man who buried his sister 30 years ago, but as the man who was finally ready to make them pay for what they'd done. The road out of town at dawn looked different than it had in the days when life felt simple. Streetlights blinked off one by one as the sky bleached from black to steel, and the world smelled like wet pavement and cold. I drove with the heater on full blast and the windows cracked just enough so the morning air could cut through the fog in my head. It felt right to let the cold in, like paying penance for years of warmth I hadn't earned. My hands gripped the wheel until the knuckles turned white. I kept expecting the phone to ring again, to give me some reason to slam on the brakes and turn around. But it was silent. The only noises were the tires on the highway and the clock on the dash, marking each stubborn mile. I thought about Anna the whole way. Little images came at me like wet leaves in the wind, her crooked grin when she stole the last cookie, the freckle on her left cheek that we called a constellation, the stubborn way she tucked her hair behind one ear when she was trying to convince me she wasn't scared. I tried to stack those images like folding blankets over the part of me that had been hollowed out. For 30 years, I'd kept that hollow safe and neat. It had a place at the table, a place on the bed, a place in every photograph. Now someone had reached in and yanked it open. Doubt gnawed at me. What if this was a trick, a sick joke by someone who'd found an old name in a newspaper and decided to play God? I remembered the way a neighbor's kid once mimicked our voices at a party, and I felt the same mixture of anger and humiliation. But then another memory would come, Anna's voice on the payphone that last night, telling me not to be late, and my certainty would snap back like a taut wire. At one point, I pulled off at a rest stop and sat with the engine ticking while the car cooled. I closed my eyes and let exhaustion take me, just for a breath. The truth is, I'm older now. My bones ache, and my patience wears thin like old rope. But there is a stubbornness in me that has never been worn away, the part of me that promised a little girl I would always look out for her. That promise had been dust for 30 years. I'd let it lie. Today, I'd decided to sweep it clean. The miles rolled by in a slow, steady rhythm. Small towns flickered past, closed diners, a dog tied to a post, a billboard advertising fishing supplies. Harbor Rest drew closer the way a distant lighthouse comes nearer, a sliver of hope on the horizon that wavers and grows as you approach. Every sign with the town name made my chest tighten. I kept thinking about what I'd say when I saw her. How do you bridge 30 years with a single look? How do you explain the funerals and the graves and the years you missed? When the highway dropped down toward the coast, the air changed. Salt and seaweed and something briny I hadn't smelled since I was young filled the car. The road narrowed and the maples thinned. Harbor Rest rose up in my windshield like a town that had been waiting for me to arrive. I slowed the car and felt a nervous foolishness I hadn't felt since courtrooms and confessions. My hands shook again, not only from the cold, but from the knowledge that whatever waited at the end of that road would decide whether I spent the rest of my life forgiving myself, or paying for a line none of us deserved. I pulled into Harbor Rest just as the sun broke over the water. The community home sat low and quiet, a rectangle of pale shingles and a swing set that creaked in the morning breeze. My heart kicked, hard and awful and expectant. I closed my eyes for one long breath, started the engine, and walked toward the front door. The Harbor Rest community home stood at the edge of the coastline like a secret trying too hard not to be found. It wasn't much, faded wood siding, cracked steps, a dull blue door that looked like it had been painted a lifetime ago. The air smelled of sea salt, damp wood, and something faintly metallic. The wind coming off the water cut straight through my jacket, but none of that mattered. My pulse thundered in my ears. I stepped inside. The lobby was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that has weight. A tired-looking woman sat behind the reception desk, tapping something on a clipboard. She didn't look up right away, and when she did, her eyes skimmed over me like I was just another visitor with old ghosts chasing him. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I got a call," I said, my voice lower than usual. "From someone who said, she's in room 12. The woman froze for just a moment, and then her expression softened. "Room 12, she repeated quietly, like the words meant something heavy. "She doesn't get many visitors." "What's your name?" "John," I said. My throat felt tight around the word. "John Dalton." Recognition flickered in her eyes, not the kind that comes from knowing a person, but the kind that comes from seeing a puzzle piece click into place. She gave a slow nod. "She's been here 8 years, she said softly. She calls herself Anna. But we've never been able to trace family. She never gave us a last name." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My heart had already left the front desk and was somewhere down that hallway, standing in front of a door I hadn't seen yet. The nurse pointed to the corridor on the right. "End of the hall. She's usually by the window. Be gentle. She's fragile." I walked down that hallway like a man moving through a dream he isn't sure he wants to wake from. The floorboards groaned beneath my boots. Each step felt heavier than the last. By the time I reached room 12, my hands were trembling so hard I had to shove them in my pockets to keep from showing it. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The room smelled faintly of lavender and disinfectant. There was a small bed, a shelf lined with worn-out books, and a single window that overlooked the gray waves rolling in from the ocean. She was sitting in a chair facing that window. Shoulders slightly hunched, hair streaked with silver. She wore a soft blue cardigan, the kind my mother used to knit in the winter. I couldn't see her face at first, just the profile, fragile, quiet, a woman who looked like she'd spent years living in the shadows of herself. Then she turned. The breath caught in my chest like a fist had closed around it. 30 years had passed. Time had carved itself into the lines around her eyes, traced itself through her hair, softened the edges of her face. But those eyes, those impossibly bright hazel eyes, were the same. My sister's eyes. Anna's eyes. Her lips parted, trembling like someone afraid to believe what they're seeing. "Johnny," she whispered. I froze. That voice. That word. Nobody had called me Johnny in decades. "It's you," she breathed. Her hand lifted slightly, as if she wasn't sure whether to reach for me or not. I moved toward her slowly, afraid any sudden motion would shatter the fragile reality holding us together. When I reached the middle of the room, I stopped. My heart was hammering. "It's me," I said. My voice cracked on the last word. She let out a sound, half gasp, half sob. "I didn't think you'd come." I wanted to say 100 things. I wanted to ask where she'd been, what had happened, why she'd let me bury her in an empty grave. But all of that disappeared the moment I saw the small scar on her knee as she shifted in the chair, the one she'd gotten when we were kids, climbing the fence at the orchard. That scar had faded over the years, but it was there. Proof. I sank to my knees in front of her. She reached out a trembling hand, and when our fingers touched, something inside me cracked wide open. Decades of guilt, grief, and rage came rushing out. I grabbed her hand and held on like I was afraid the world would tear her away again. Her shoulders shook as she cried, soundlessly at first. Then the sobs came, raw and unrestrained. My own tears followed before I even realized it. "I thought you were dead," I whispered. "I was," she said through the tears. "For a long time. I was. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, just two old souls clinging to the pieces of a broken past. And then, when the silence returned, she whispered something that made every muscle in my body go still. "Johnny, it wasn't an accident." Her fingers tightened around mine. Her eyes flicked toward the window, like the ocean itself was holding a secret. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly, already knowing this wasn't going to end with just a reunion. She swallowed hard. "They tried to kill me." And just like that, the grief I'd carried for 30 years twisted into something new. Something sharper. Revenge had a heartbeat. And it was mine. For a long moment after Anna said those words, the room was silent except for the soft crash of the waves outside. "They tried to kill me." The sentence hung in the air like a blade, sharp and cold. I felt something shift inside me, a slow, deliberate tightening. 30 years of buried pain were now twisting into something alive. Something with purpose. I pulled a chair closer and sat across from her, still holding her hand. "Anna," I said quietly, "I need you to tell me everything. From the start." She looked down at her hands, as if the answers were carved into her skin. "I don't remember it all," she began slowly. "Not everything. But I know the crash, it wasn't just an accident. There were two men. I saw them right before everything went black." Her voice trembled, but she kept talking. "One of them grabbed me when the bus swerved. I heard someone shout something. Then there was a sound, metal, snapping. And then, darkness." I clenched my jaw. "Two men. What did they look like?" She shook her head, wincing as if the effort to remember hurt. "Faces are blurry. But one of them had a ring, a big silver ring with a crest. I'll never forget that." She traced a circle in the air with her finger. "I saw it when he reached for me." I leaned back slowly, breathing through the heat rising in my chest. A ring with a crest. That wasn't random. That was a mark, and marks meant people who thought they were untouchable. "After the crash," she continued, "I woke up in a place I didn't recognize. A small room. White walls. My head hurt so badly I couldn't see straight. There was a woman who said I'd been found unconscious on the side of the road. But she wasn't a nurse, not a real one. I know that now." My grip on her hand tightened. "What happened then?" "They kept me there for weeks. Or maybe months, I can't tell. They didn't call anyone. They didn't let me leave. My memory was gone. I didn't know my name, or yours, or anything. I was just someone to keep quiet. And then one day, they dumped me in harbor rest. Told the people here I was a vagrant. By the time I started remembering pieces, years had passed." She lifted her chin then, eyes shining with a strange mix of fear and fury. "Johnny, someone wanted me dead. And when they couldn't finish the job, they erased me." I sat there in stunned silence. I'd spent 3 decades believing fate had ripped her away from me. But it wasn't fate. It was someone's choice. I stood up abruptly, pacing the small room. The anger sat heavy in my gut, pulsing. "We're not leaving this to memories," I said finally. "We're getting proof." She frowned. "How?" "DNA first," I said. "We make it official. If anyone tries to say you're not who you are, we'll have the papers to shut them down." "And then?" she asked. "Then," I said, meeting her eyes, "we find whoever wore that ring." That afternoon, I drove her to a private lab in the city. The technician swabbed our cheeks, sealed the samples, and promised results in 48 hours. As we signed the forms, I noticed Anna's hands shaking, though not from fear anymore. This was something else. Determination. When we stepped out into the cool air, she stopped me on the sidewalk. "Johnny, what if this opens something dangerous?" I looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who had survived 30 years in the shadows. This woman who wasn't supposed to be alive. Anna, I said, my voice steady, danger already came for us. Now it's our turn. She nodded slowly. For the first time since the call, she didn't look like someone lost. She looked like someone ready to remember. That night, in the small hotel near the harbor, I sat awake while Anna slept in the next room. My mind turned over everything she'd said. 2 men. A ring with a crest. A fake nurse. Erased from the world like she was nothing. I opened the drawer of the nightstand and pulled out the old box I kept hidden for years. Inside were photographs, clippings, and the yellowed death certificate they'd made me sign. I laid them out on the table, the past staring back at me. This time, I wasn't looking at a tragedy. I was looking at a cover-up. And someone out there was going to pay for it. The 48 hours felt like a lifetime and a blink at the same time. Waiting for the lab results was like sitting on a ledge, looking down at everything you were afraid to name. I paced the hotel room until the soles of my shoes wore thin, replaying every scrap of Anna's story in my head: 2 men, a crest ring, a fake nurse. Each detail felt like a thread leading somewhere dark. On the morning the lab called, I was drinking coffee that had gone cold. My hands trembled when I answered. Hello. I managed. Mr. Dalton, the technician said. This is Sarah Chen from Harbor Genetics. The results are conclusive. The probability of siblingship is 99.97%. You and the second party are biological siblings. For a moment, nothing registered. The words sat in my ear like pebbles. You're certain? I asked, though my voice sounded distant to my own ears. Yes, sir. The markers are definitive. We can email you the full report if you'd like. The world shifted. I should have been elated, jumping, shouting, calling everyone I knew. Instead I felt a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. 100 feelings collided: relief, gratefulness, a raw, gnawing guilt that made my knees weak. I drove back to Harbor Rest like a man who had just been given a verdict and a sentence at the same time. When I walked into room 12 and saw Anna looking up from the window, the sound I let out was both a laugh and a sob. I handed her the phone. She read the words aloud, eyes scanning the technical language that suddenly made everything real. It's us, she said, voice small. You're my brother. We sat there for a long time after that, holding hands like people who had been plucked from 2 different rivers and set on the same bank. Joy tasted strange, salted by 30 years of lost time. The truth unlocked something, but it also opened doors I'd hoped would stay closed. After the DNA result, the pieces began to fall faster. I spent hours at the harbor library while Anna slept: old newspapers, microfiche, archived police blotters. I learned that the night of the crash had been chaotic. The bus had slid off an icy bend, collisions and fires, witnesses scattered. But buried in one thin column paragraph was a line that made my stomach drop: coroner confirms ID based on personal effects. No mention of dental records. No mention of fingerprinting. Just a line that implied they had matched a purse and a jacket and called it a day. I tracked down someone who'd been an orderly at the county morgue back then, an older man who still lived in the same town and who owed me a favor from years ago. He met me at a diner and, after staring at the photos I'd brought, said in a low voice, we were under orders to process victims quick. Families were broken. Paperwork was lighter than it should have been. There were complications. He wouldn't say more without someone forcing his hand, but the way he looked at me told me enough. Then Dr. Evelyn Price came into the story, retired now, but once the closest thing we had to a forensics nurse in that part of the province. I found her through a friend of a friend, nervous and wary at first, but when I explained Anna's story her hands went cold. She invited me into her modest office and, over the next few hours, she walked me through what could have happened. Young people get misidentified in disasters, she said plainly, especially when bodies are burned or deformed. Families are in shock. Someone hears what they want to hear. But there's more I think you should know. She slid across a thin stack of documents, old internal memos, logs that had been saved by someone who never quite trusted the official line. One memo mentioned unclaimed victims and temporary release to third parties, with a stamped signature that I recognized, an emblematic crest I'd seen in Anna's shaky memory, the one on the ring. Someone higher up had the authority to sign people out. Someone who had a lot to lose if questions were asked. I felt my pulse spike. Are you saying someone took her? I asked, voice barely more than a whisper. Dr. Price nodded slowly. Not all the bodies make it into the records we see. And when an influential person wants their hands on something, records get tidy. Armed now with bad faith in my fingertips and the DNA report in my pocket, I went to the police. The officer I met with was older than the paperwork suggested he should be, a man who remembered the night and the messy way things had been processed. He couldn't promise much, but he agreed to reopen the file on the condition I had more evidence. What came next was a blur of interviews, dusty boxes, the kind of bureaucratic digging that costs time and patience and a man's temper. But the story that emerged was ugly and precise. A small group of men involved in local enterprises, logging contracts, off-books labor, favors exchanged, had been seen around the highway that night. A few names kept surfacing, whispered like a dare. One of them matched the description from Anna's memory, a heavy-set man who always wore a silver crest ring. A crest that had belonged to a local contractor with ties everywhere. When I confronted him, not with threats, but with the cold, hard facts we had collected, his face did something like denial at first. But when I said the name of the company, when I produced the documents showing transactions and the morgue memos, he paled. The ring, he said, had been pawned years ago. He denied involvement. He said he'd been at a lodge that night. He gave me alibis and lawyers. Even so, the admission by Dr. Price and the coroner's logs were enough to change the course of things. An official inquiry began, small and slow and cumbersome, but it moved. It forced eyes open that had been closed for too long. It didn't bring back the 30 years, but it brought truth into the light. For me, the truth was a double edge. I wept with relief that Anna was alive and with a furious, hollow sorrow for the years she'd been stolen. I wept for my mother, who died believing her daughter was under the ground, and I felt an ache so thick that I couldn't breathe. The knowledge that I had signed the papers, young, stunned, convinced, was a wound. I had trusted them. I had identified a face ravaged by fire and trauma because I wanted certainty. But now I had to live with the possibility that my certainty helped bury her. Anna sat beside me one evening, looking at the old grave marker with her name on it. She touched the carved letters gently, as if feeling the ridges could tell her something about the girl she had been and the life she lost. I don't remember all of her, she said softly. Sometimes I'm afraid I never will. I put my arm around her then, holding her like the sheltering thing a brother should have been all along. We'll find her again, I whispered, not just the girl with the freckled nose, but the life that had been taken from us. We'll remember together. The inquiry would take time. The men with crested rings would stonewall. There would be lawyers and resistance and the slow churn of justice. But for the first time in 30 years, I had proof, and proof was a weapon of its own. The first night Anna stayed with me after everything came out felt like something between a dream and a wound. She slept in the room that had once belonged to our mother, the same room she'd helped paint when we were kids. It still smelled faintly of cedar and soap, though 30 years had passed since the last time she'd stepped inside that house. I watched her as she walked down the hallway earlier that evening, pausing at every framed photograph like she was piecing together someone else's life, her life. She ran her fingers along the picture of the two of us at the county fair, the one where she wore a red sweater and I held a stuffed bear over my head because she couldn't reach it. Her expression flickered between recognition and disbelief. We were both older now. She wasn't the fiery, stubborn 20-year-old I buried. She was 60, lined by years she couldn't remember. But when she looked at me, it wasn't just the past I saw in her eyes, it was something alive, something that had survived everything. We woke early the next morning. I made coffee the way she used to like it, 1 sugar, no cream. She laughed softly when she took the first sip, like the taste reached into a part of her brain that hadn't completely faded. "You still remember," she said. "Every damn thing," I replied. We didn't talk much during breakfast. Words felt too small for everything sitting between us. But after the plates were cleared, Anna surprised me. She asked if she could see it, the grave. I hesitated, my hand tightening around my cup. "Are you sure?" She nodded slowly. "I want to face it." We drove in silence to the cemetery. The air was heavy with low clouds, and the trees at the edge of the property were bare, their black branches reaching out like old scars. When we reached the headstone, she stood still. Her name was etched in the stone exactly as it had been 30 years ago. Anna Marie Dalton. 1974 to 1994. Always our light. She knelt down slowly, touched the engraved letters with a tenderness that broke me all over again. "This is where they buried the lie," she whispered. I didn't speak. I just knelt beside her. "They erased me," she said quietly. "But you didn't." "Not really. You kept me alive in here." She pressed her fingers against my chest. I felt something tighten in my throat. "I didn't protect you," I said. "I buried the wrong girl and believed it was you. I lived with that for 3 decades. She turned her head toward me, eyes damp but steady. "Johnny, none of this was your fault. But the thing about guilt is it doesn't need permission to exist. It grows roots in silence. And mine had been festering for 30 years. After the cemetery, we returned home. For the first time since she came back, she walked into her old bedroom. The walls were the same soft green, the ceiling fan still creaked on the lowest setting, and the old wooden desk still had a faint etching of her name carved into its side. She ran her hand over it like she was touching the skin of a forgotten part of herself. I stood in the doorway, watching her shoulders rise and fall. I knew what she wasn't saying. There's no way to reclaim 3 lost decades. No way to rewrite everything that had been stolen. But revenge, justice, that was something I could still take. Over the next few weeks, while the official inquiry ground its slow gears, I started digging where they didn't. Old connections. Old favors. Faces that had aged into their secrets. The name behind that crest ring wasn't just a random thug. It belonged to a man who'd built a small empire on forced labor, drugs, and bought silence. A man who thought 30 years buried a crime forever. He had no idea what it meant to leave a Dalton alive. Anna watched me during those weeks. She saw the way my voice lowered when I made calls, the way my hands clenched on the table when I found another piece of their network. She didn't ask questions at first. She just sat in the kitchen, quietly threading her fingers through the steam rising from her coffee. But the night I came home with a stack of old documents, evidence, names, locations, she finally said it. "You're not just looking for answers anymore," she whispered. "No," I said simply. "I'm looking for them. You're going to burn everything they built." I didn't answer, but she didn't need me to. She walked to the table, touched the papers, and for the first time since she'd come back, I saw the old fire in her eyes, the one she used to have when she got into fights with kids twice her size. She was tired, and fragile in places, but that fire, it had never really died. "They stole my life," she said. "If you're going after them, I want in." I tried to protest, but she held up her hand. "Johnny, for 30 years I was a ghost. This time, I'm not sitting on the sidelines while other people write the ending." So that became our new routine. In the mornings, we rebuilt. She started seeing a therapist, learned to use a smartphone, tried cooking again, fumbling through recipes she half remembered. At night, we planned. Carefully. Quietly. I traced names. She recalled pieces. We built the map together. And somewhere between the rage and the long silences, I realized something. This wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It was about taking back everything they stole. The second call to action would come naturally now. "If you're still listening," I said softly one night, speaking to the camera I'd set up to document our fight, "and if stories of blood, loyalty, and second chances mean something to you, make sure you subscribe. Because what's coming next isn't just a story. It's war." Anna didn't flinch. She just whispered, "Let's finish what they started." The girl I buried 30 years ago was gone. But the woman who survived them? She was more dangerous than any of them could imagine. Months have a way of folding back into themselves when you're busy rebuilding a life. What felt impossible the night the phone rang, the idea that my sister could be alive, that justice might be clawed back from decades of quiet corruption, became, in small, stubborn increments, something we lived inside every day. Anna and I settled into a strange, new rhythm. Mornings were for simple things: coffee, the paper, the small rituals that had once knitted our family together. She relearned how to make my mother's blueberry pancakes, slow at first, burning the edges, then getting better each week. She liked the ritual of stirring and watching the batter slide off the spoon. Sometimes, when the sun hit her face just right, you could almost see the girl she had been wincing through the woman she had become. Afternoons were for appointments. Therapy, mostly. The therapist called the condition complex trauma with dissociative gaps, which sounded clinical and heavy and somehow not enough for what she carried. But Anna showed up. She did the homework. She learned grounding techniques, naming 5 things she could see, feeling the wooden chair under her thighs, counting breaths until the panic loosened its grip. Some nights she woke from nightmares drenched in sweat, mouthing fragments of a life we were trying to stitch back together. Other nights she laughed so hard with my grandson that the house filled with a sound I thought I'd only remember from old photographs. There were small victories that mattered more than any headline. She remembered the dog we had as children, Maggie, and the squeaky toy she'd loved. She found an old sketchbook tucked behind a box and smiled at drawings that had once been her dreams. One evening, she hummed the same tune she used to sing when she was nervous, the one that used to make Mom smile. The first time she did that after she came home, I sat very still and let the sound fill the kitchen. It felt like an offering we'd both been waiting for. We had to make decisions that felt like tilting at windmills. There was the headstone in the cemetery, her name carved into stone with dates that no longer matched what we now knew. We talked about removing it, about changing it into a memorial that acknowledged the unknown years. In the end, we left it. Not because we were comfortable with the lie it represented, but because it had been the only place my mother had poured her grief. We planted flowers there every spring and carried the truth with us when we left. The inquiry moved forward in fits and starts. Men who had once thought themselves invisible started to look over their shoulders. Lawyers were involved. Old alliances creaked and shifted. I learned the brutal truth about how people can take what they want when they know no one will ask questions. I learned, too, the stubborn power of one man who refuses to be quiet. I will not pretend the path to consequences was clean or immediate. It wasn't. There were delays, threats, and the grinding bureaucracy of a justice system that favors the patient and the well-funded. But we got subpoenas, depositions, and, finally, enough pressure on the right people that those who had pawned their consciences found themselves answering to others. Through all that, Anna grew in ways I didn't expect. She developed a steady job at a small community garden, hands in soil, a task with honest feedback. Dirt under her nails, she told me it reminded her of summer afternoons back at the old house. A neighbor started bringing over vegetable soup, and the kids in the neighborhood made her a birthday card with a crooked sun. Small kindnesses, but they became the scaffolding on which she built a new sense of self. Forgiveness was not a straight line. I had nights when the guilt pulled me under. I would wake in the dark and see the coroner's office, the folded sheet, the look on my mother's face. I asked myself the hard questions, over and over: did I do enough? Could I have done things differently? But slowly, through therapy and the honest reckoning with others who'd been complicit, I learned to hold both truths, that I had been wrong in my certainty and that I had loved her enough to try to piece her back together when she returned. That didn't erase the past. But it gave me a way to breathe again. Anna forgave me in her own way, not with a neat, cinematic absolution, but with the quiet acts of someone who trusted me with a fragile part of herself. Her forgiveness was a handshake across miles of lost years. It was not perfect. It was enough. We never stopped talking about the girl she used to be. Sometimes she would sit on the back deck, watch the lake, and say, "Do you think she's still in there somewhere?" I would hold her hand and say, "I think she's in both of you. And we'll find her, bit by bit." It was an optimistic thing to say, and sometimes it felt ridiculous. But optimism is a muscle, and we flexed it together. On quiet nights, when the house was still and the world felt less sharp, I would walk down to the small room where I kept the old box of clippings, yellowed newspaper articles, the death certificate with my signature, the shaky photos from the morgue. I'd place my palm over them and whisper an apology that had no audience. It was private. It was not a replacement for justice. But it was an act of letting go. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not tidy. It is messy as life itself. I learned that grief is not a single event but a long series of decisions. I learned that truth, once uncovered, does not always bring neat endings, but it brings a chance to rebuild. I learned that some people will try to bury the past so thoroughly they expect the world to forget. And I learned that if you refuse to let them, if you keep asking and pushing and loving with a stubbornness that looks almost like obsession, that past can be dragged into daylight. So what happens now? We live one ordinary day at a time. Anna tends her plants and remembers the smell of Mom's kitchen. My children have met their aunt, they are cautious and curious, learning to reconcile the ghost in photographs with the woman who brings them jam when they visit. The inquiry continues at its slow, imperfect pace. I still have nights when anger wakes me. I still tighten my fists in my sleep sometimes, dreaming of the men who thought they'd been clever. But the thing that surprises me most is how ordinary it all feels most days. There is a quiet life in the small routines. There's laughter at the table. There's the sound of Anna humming while she washes dishes. There's a tenderness in the way she reaches for a photo and smiles like she's discovering an old, beloved song. 30 years ago, I stood at a grave and thought that was the end of the story. Last month, a voice at midnight proved I was wrong. Life does not always give second chances, but sometimes it does. When it does, you hold on with both hands, and you spend the rest of your days making it count. If this story touched you, if it made you think about family, about justice, or about the strange mercy of time, then thank you for listening. And if you want to hear what happens next, to follow the truth as it unfurls, consider subscribing. We're not finished yet.